All right. Hi, Nick. Welcome.
Hello.
Nice room full here in Amsterdam. Thanks for making this work amongst all the work. Yeah, I think if you want, I know you guys had a little sort of intro. Maybe you should start there and then get into the conversation. Maybe get people up to speed that haven't had a chance to read the book yet, and go from there.
Yeah, sounds good.
All right, awesome.
So yeah, I'll just start off. Hi, everybody. I'm Nick. Helen will hopefully be joining us. She's right now putting our two oldest children to bed. They're always a bit difficult at bedtime, so it might be a little while. But yeah, today I'm going to talk about our new book called After Work. And then I know Bryan has some excellent questions lined up. And then we'll take some questions from the audience as well. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. I'm going to have some PowerPoints here. Let's see, should all work. Okay, hopefully that looks good on the screen. Good, okay. So yeah, After Work is the name of our book. It starts off from really the past 15 years or so of fears about what new work is going to look like, what the future of work is going to look like. So this particularly starts, I would say, in 2008 with the global financial crisis. You start to see the rise of things like the gig economy. So, you know, all of that emerges after 2008, the gig economy. But you also start to see your fears about automation really reemerge. So there's, I think, a 2013 paper from Oxford University, which got a lot of attention, basically argued that, you know, 47% of new jobs in America, 47% of all jobs in America could potentially be automated over the next 2 decades. And this was one amongst many, many papers saying that there was going to be a whole slew of new automation occurring and mass unemployment possible. Now, there's been some critiques of this work. I think one of my favorites probably comes from Aaron Beninav, and he argues that, you know, probably this automation isn't going to take a lot of jobs. It will disrupt the labor force, but what's really going on here is a fear about good work. And this is a long, long decline in the nature of work, where work is becoming more intense, it's paying less, it's longer hours. So really, this fears about automation are fears about the lack of good jobs that are possible. Now, one response to this lack of good jobs that's occurring right now comes from policymakers, and they say, well, what we need is more education. We need people to be trained for jobs. So university, for instance, should be turned into effectively a job training institute, and that people should expect to have to reskill over the course of their entire lives, up until they die, really. That's what policymakers say. You get slightly more radical responses from people like Danny Roderick, who will argue that what we really need is we need to make good jobs possible again. So we need to think about what the nature of a good job is, and we need to guarantee and build the institutions which allow us to have good jobs in the future. Now, the more radical response, though, comes from the post-work approach, which is also really sort of picked up over the past 10 years. And the post-work approach says, well, none of these approaches to making good work are sufficient to deal with the problem. And in fact, the problem lies with the centrality of work itself. So it's not that we have just bad work, it's that we have work at all as being so central to our society. So the advocates of post-work, and I would include myself in this, they take this perceived crisis of too few good jobs, and they argue that it should form the basis of a new political and economic order where everyone sees their work reduced and their dependency on the market lessened. So work here should be framed as a problem rather than a solution, and we should seek to be emancipated from labor rather than through labor. Now, the reason why post-work approaches see work as such a problem is that it's not just the sort of contemporary version of work which is an issue, but rather its general capitalist form, which is the problem. And there's two problems with work understood as wage labor. The first is that workers are routinely subject to control during their time on the job, and increasingly outside of it as well. So you think about the number of employers, for instance, who are firing employees for things that they've said on social media. So this is, the exertion of control over your life outside of work as well. And wage labor means that we sell a considerable portion of our time to people or organizations who then have significant amounts of control over us. So one of the most recent clear examples of this came in December 2021, when 6 Amazon warehouse workers died when a tornado hit the warehouse they were working in. They had asked their management to leave because they feared the tornado, but management said, no, you have to stay, and they lost their lives as a result of this control. Now, beyond just this personal domination, though, which is exhibited by managers and bosses, wage labor is also unfree by virtue of the impersonal domination of capitalism's imperatives. Now, this is a big word, but what does it mean? For the vast majority of humanity, it simply translates to the fact that in order to survive, we have to subject ourselves to wage labor. We have no choice but to work, or we face the pain of homelessness, starvation, and destitution. So no matter how good a job is, it still remains subject to these two unfreedoms. And the post-work approach, or the anti-work approach, begins from these premises that wage labor is fundamentally unfree, and it seeks to abolish this social form. So our book, with Helen and I, fits in with this line of thinking, but it takes off from a very simple observation, that when people talk about robots taking jobs, they're typically imagining factories, offices, and warehouses, but not hospitals, nursing homes, and domestic spaces. So in other words, the sort of work that is imagined to disappear is what has traditionally been deemed male work. And the work that's often associated with women, the work of social reproduction, of caring, of cleaning, of cooking, that gets left out in these stories about the future of work. Now, the silence around this work is important, not only because of the gender imbalances that it maintains, but also because a majority of work, both paid and unpaid, is in fact now taken up by this sort of social reproduction work. So, on the one hand, social reproduction is a major source of jobs, both public and private. So if we look at the NHS, for instance, it's among the biggest employers in the world. And this chart here comes from the book, and we looked into detailed national figures to try and figure out how much of the workforce is devoted towards reproductive labor. So things like hospitality services, education, healthcare, care work in general, food services. And what we see is that since the 1970s, at least, in all of the rich countries, reproductive work is taking up a growing amount of jobs. In some cases, pushing over 30%. Now, to give you a comparison, when we talk about America being something like a manufacturing powerhouse back in the 1960s, they only had 30% of their workforce devoted towards manufacturing. But we spoke of a manufacturing powerhouse at that time. And I think today we need to speak of reproductive labor in the same sort of terms. We often use this term that these are service economies, but service is such a big, baggy concept, and it doesn't really make sense to think of our economies in those terms. What we have is economies that are increasingly based around social reproduction. Now, crucially, these numbers only look set to grow in the future. So if we look at various government predictions, so the US and the UK, for instance, they do little reports where they forecast the next 10 years of jobs. And one journalist went and looked at the US report, and he noted that 9 of the 12 fastest growing fields are different ways of saying nurse. If we look at the UK's reports for the next 10 years of job growth, 47% of new jobs are set to be in social reproduction. So yes, social reproduction is already taking up a large portion of the waged workforce, but it's only going to take up more in the future as well. So the future of work is not coding, but in fact caring. All of this is then re-emphasized when we look at unwaged work. So work that's typically done in the home without pay. By our calculations, unwaged work, and most of which is reproductive work, takes up around 40% of society's total time spent on work. And it varies from country to country, as you can see in this chart here, but on average, it's around 40 to 45%. So a huge amount of society's time spent working is on reproductive work, whether it be unwaged or whether it be waged. So if we want to talk about post-work without discussing reproductive labor, we're going to miss most of the work that society is in fact doing. If we want to talk about the end of work, we have to talk about reproductive labor. So our book tries to rectify this lack of discussion in debates about the future of work. But as many feminists have pointed out, there are difficulties in applying post-work ideas to reproductive labor. So traditional idea for post-work thinking is, well, we just reduce the amount of work that we need to do. If we're talking about reproductive labor, does that mean that we're giving less care to people who are already desperately in need of care? Does it mean that we need to have robots doing all of this care work? Does applying post-work thinking to reproductive labor, does that mean that the elderly and the disabled have to give up any sort of independence and autonomy and be forced into institutions against their will oftentimes? Basically, these are the sorts of challenges that arise when we think about applying post-work ideas to reproductive work. And the crux of our book is that we have to rethink both of these things. We have to rethink post-work as a project, but also social reproduction and the way that we organize it. So we look at 4 key themes to try and do this. We look at technologies, standards, families, and domestic spaces in particular. And each of these is an area where we try to show how, over the past century or so, experiments have been undertaken to reduce the amount of reproductive work done in the home, but that these efforts have almost always been stymied for some reason or another. So we can take technology, for instance. In post-work visions, technology looms large because it promises to facilitate both an increase in living standards as well as a reduction in the amount of work. So technology promises to be a win-win sort of situation. And in the early 20th century, the home, in fact, underwent a radical technological change as it became industrialized. So homes became connected, sewers, water lines, electricity, gas, and then new devices emerged to take advantage of these connections. So things like washers and dryers, dishwashers, vacuums, fridges, freezers, and so on. All of these devices started to emerge in the early 20th century and then get adopted into homes. So all sorts of new labor-saving devices being introduced into the home at this time. Now, in the 1970s, a number of researchers, most notably Ruth Schwartz-Cohen, started to look at the amount of time that housewives were performing in the home compared to pre-industrial periods. And this is interesting because it would seem obvious that all these labor-saving devices in the home would save labor. But what these researchers found was that housewives in the 1970s were doing as much work as housewives in the 1900s. So this is Cohen's paradox. Labor-saving technologies in the home were not actually saving labor. And things haven't got much better since that pioneering research. If you look from the 1970s, the only properly new domestic technology has been the microwave, the only successful one at least. There's been lots of little kitchen gadgets and things that have been developed, but nothing that has really come anywhere close to rivaling, a washer and a dryer and a vacuum and a fridge and stuff like that. And so even to this day, various studies find that while there have been changes in the type of work which is done in the home, and there's changes in who is doing that work, so women are doing much less work in the home and men are doing a little bit more work. But when we look at the average person, we're still doing around 25 hours of work in the home, the same as we did a century ago, at least according to this paper. So domestic technology has not fulfilled its promise of freedom. And one of the key reasons why has to do with rising expectations, which is the second of our key themes. So again, Cohen was a pioneer in thinking about this, in trying to explain her paradox. she looked to rising standards around things like cleanliness and hygiene. And she pointed to the fact that in the early 1900s, discourses around hygiene, scientific discourses in particular, were starting to incentivize much more cleanliness in the home. So if you wanted to keep germs at bay, you had to be keeping the home much, much cleaner. But there was also intermingled with this less scientific discourses based around imperialism, based around racially biased ideas of cleanliness, and also based around class-oriented ideas of cleanliness. So, even to this day, sometimes you'll hear people talk about the working class as the great unwashed masses. And already implicit within that is, a sort of status distinction between the working classes who are unclean and the middle and upper classes who are clean. So all of these things were driving rising expectations about how clean your home was supposed to be. So new devices might have been making cleaning the home easier, but the expectations were rising at the same time. In the words of one historian, laundry went from being a weekly nightmare to an unending task. And I've got 3 children in my house, and I can tell you it is absolutely an unending task at the moment. Now, in our book, we try and continue this line of thinking about standards, but we broaden it out beyond just cleanliness. And we look at how there's a complex story about these social standards that intermingles scientific knowledge, class biases, advertiser budgets, all of these sorts of things which have come to shape these social norms and their development over the past century. Now, in the decades since Cohen was writing, some expectations have in fact decreased. Cooking is one of the most notable ones. These sort of elaborate 3-course meals that might have been popularized in the 1950s. That's not really expected anymore. Even when you have guests over, very few expectations of a multi-course meal. And there's more and more acceptance of takeaways, ordering food from Uber Eats or something like that, and having it delivered. And in fact, when you look at how much time people are spending on things like cooking, it's decreased in almost every country, with the exception of France. France is spending 1 more minute on cooking than they did in the 1970s, which I find sort of peculiar, but telling about the French approach to food. So some expectations have decreased over time. By contrast, though, other expectations have significantly increased. And I think one of the most surprising findings we came across in the book was that the time that parents are spending on children has significantly increased since the 1970s. And this is fascinating because we no longer have the stay-at-home mom as the sort of dominant family form. Instead, it's both parents working in the workforce. And so, you would expect that with less time in the home, there'd be less time spent on children. That's not what we find. Parents are spending more and more time on their children. And the key reason why it makes a certain rational sense. So parents are concerned about getting the best lives for their children. And in order to do that, they consider, well, their kids need to get a good job. And in order to get a good job, you need to get a good education to get into the best universities. And in order to do that, the idea is that you need to start training your children and have them become little bundles of human capital as soon as they're born, if not before. So parents are now incentivized by this competition for university places and for decent jobs. They're now incentivized to spend more and more time on raising their children, or their little bundles of human capital. So social standards is one of the key reasons why technology hasn't really impacted the amount of work that's being done in the home. Another key reason has to do with the nuclear family. So nuclear family as, mom, dad, 2 biological children in a single family, often suburban home. This is, the sort of archetype, at least from the 1950s, the archetypal family. But there is, in fact, a considerable lived diversity in terms of how people actually organize their domestic lives. But this idea of the nuclear family continues to have a lot of sway as a cultural ideal, and it's actively reinforced by the state through regulations, laws, benefits, things like that. But in terms of reproductive work, the family is wildly inefficient, and it's a vast repository of gendered inequalities. So women still remain responsible for the bulk of unwaged social reproduction, even though they're now working more and more in the waged workplace. And there's also qualitative differences to consider when we're talking about work within the family. So studies show that fathers tend to do less of the routine physical and logistical caregiving tasks, and they spend more time doing sort of comparatively enjoyable things. So talk-based educational and recreational activities. They're playing with children rather than changing their nappies, for instance. Now, on top of this, most of the time that fathers spend caring for their children also takes place when mothers are also present. So there's this sort of delegation or distribution of responsibility. Mothers, by contrast, are much more likely to be looking after children on their own, so when the father is away for whatever reason. Now, the way in which unpaid domestic work is conventionally distributed within heterosexual nuclear families therefore actively promotes a rest and relaxation deficit for particular kinds of caregivers. It's largely women who are left sleepless, harried, and starved of a life beyond the demands of caring for others. Now, acknowledging inequalities within the family, though, can only get us so far, given that many of the problems involved are embedded within the family form itself. Now, as Cohen notes, nuclear families, in and of themselves, invite a massive duplication of effort. So as she writes at one point, out there in the land of household work, there are small industrial plants which sit idle for a better part of every working day. There are expensive pieces of highly mechanized equipment which only get used once or twice a month. There are consumption units which weekly trundle out to their markets to buy 8 ounces of this non-perishable product and 12 ounces of that one. So the family itself is a wildly inefficient way to do social reproduction. And this points to the importance of extending any fight for free time beyond the waged workplace to people's own homes. From our point of view, it's hard to see any route out of the current reproductive crisis that doesn't extend to a fundamental rethinking of the family and its role in our reproductive regime. So one that puts into question sedimented assumptions about the proper role of the family, social standards, domestic technologies, and the home. And this brings us to the final of the 4 areas that we explored. So another factor counting against the family is the fact that while it's often assumed to be quasi-universal, it's in fact rather unevenly distributed, particularly this nuclear family. People choose or are forced into all kinds of different living arrangements, to the point where the nuclear family no longer holds as a statistical norm. Single parents, lone individuals, multi-generational families, child-free couples, empty nesters, and so on are driving increased diversity when it comes to domestic arrangements, which means that over the past 50 years or so, the nuclear family has persisted as a cultural idea while becoming less and less common as a lived reality. While households have evolved, though, houses themselves have not, and house builders still favor single-family dwellings. The result is not only a rather inconvenient mismatch between housing stock and its residents, but also the reinforcement of a certain kind of domestic imaginary about the ways in which we're supposed to live. And we call this the state of affairs domestic realism, sort of linking back to Mark Fisher's idea of capitalist realism. Domestic realism is the phenomenon whereby the isolated dwelling becomes so accepted and commonplace that it's almost impossible to imagine life being organized through any other form. That this should be the case, despite many people's lived experiences of the pressures and difficulties attendant upon unpaid domestic work, makes such an attitude all the more remarkable. Now, it's our contention that the home represents a crucial and often overlooked example of material hegemony in action. Domestic dwellings can be understood as contributing to the solidification of governance through their subtle closing off of options and their contribution to producing generalized consent to an existing order. But there are many other possible forms of domestic arrangement, aside from the atomized and depoliticized family residence we most closely associate with the home today. Indeed, it's important that we understand the built environment and its infrastructure not only as means of registering and consolidating dominant political positions, but also as a potential site for intervention and as a territory for contestation. So interrogating the spaces of reproductive labor may be one way of contributing to the construction of a new kind of explicitly feminist and anti-work common sense. It's for this reason in the book we end up exploring various counterexamples and experimental alternatives of living spaces. So we look at things like Soviet collective living to interwar European social housing to the hippie communes of the 1960s and 1970s. And we try and look at why these things failed or where they did fail, and also in what ways they may have succeeded. And what can we learn from them today to think about what an alternative order outside of domestic realism might look like. So this brings us to the final section of the talk here, where we talk about what can we do. And in thinking about what we could do, we came up with a challenge of not trying to set out, a blueprint for the future. We can't set out every single detail of what we want a future society to look like, either because it would be futile to try and detail everything, or because it would be, simply too easy to imagine a sort of perfect world. The real challenge is thinking about where do we want to go in the long term, but also what can we do in the present moment. And one of the ways in which we tried to do this is to think about 3 different principles as sort of guiding ideas for thinking about what we want in the future, but also what might be a decent change we can make today. So these 3 broad principles are communal care, public luxury, and temporal sovereignty. And so I'll round off our talk here by looking at these. Now, the first of them is communal care. So this is our answer to some of the problems commonly associated with the family as it stands today, particularly when it comes to the unwaged domestic work. So today, the family is a system of privatized care, which is massively overburdened by the demands that are placed upon it. The family cannot and should not be the sole linchpin for managing so much of our caring needs in society, and we instead need to foster the transformation and expansion of caring relations. This is sort of the flip side of family abolition, I would say. Family abolition, at least in name, focuses on, what it wants to get rid of, the institution of the nuclear family, at least. And communal care, we're trying to point to emphasize, the opposite side. What sort of institutions do we want to build beyond the family? And there's sort of 2 guiding ideas at the center of communal care. First is to reduce the pressures that compel people to live and stay in the nuclear family. So this means things like challenging state policies that currently privilege the family. It also means changing policies so that they can better accommodate non-nuclear living arrangements, but also means thinking about different types of communal housing as well. The second aspect of communal care would be to build the alternative institutions required to enable new approaches to care to actually flourish. So take childcare as one example. In the kind of society that we're envisioning, much greater support for communal childcare would be available, in particular in the form of high quality 24-hour universal childcare. Now, there are some recent models from which we might draw inspiration here. A really recent example is Portugal, which is currently rolling out free universal early years childcare. Or we could turn to Denmark, where government support for childcare has been steadily increasing in recent years. High quality daycare is now guaranteed and heavily subsidized, and for the poorest, access is free. Staff there are also mostly professionalized and decently paid, and a large portion of that government financed care is also organized by the voluntary nonprofit sector, which I think interestingly points to the fact that we can get governments to support things by financing them without actually having to provide them. Sort of typical critique of state provision of these forms of care. I think there are ways that we can imagine better alternatives. So that's one example of communal care, something like universal 24/7 childcare. Our second guiding principle is public luxury. Now, luxury is typically conceived of as a positional good, so it's a pure status object that, because you don't have something and I do have it, it gives me greater status. And so it seems like the idea of public luxury is completely a contradiction in terms. How do we have public luxury? Well, we can think about luxury not as a status object, but instead as high quality, regardless of the quantity of supply available. And this is luxury that goes beyond mere need. So this is clearly more compatible with the notion of public luxury. After all, as one trade union boss once put it, nothing is too good for the working classes. Now, a public luxury model would provide the infrastructure needed for the collectivization of some reproductive labor beyond the single-family home, but it would also extend to things like wonderful parks and playgrounds, public sports centers and swimming pools, galleries, allotments, and public transport networks. Now, while public provision, particularly in the US and the UK, is often seen as a last resort, it's often these sort of low-quality backups to be endured by the poorest in society. Public luxury instead demands more. And we can easily draw inspiration from places like Helsinki's Udi Library, Moscow's famous metro stations, or the stylish public housing of Vienna and their rooftop pools, which I still find amazing and such a great model for public luxury. Now, indeed, there are all kinds of case studies we could look at to offer here, but let's quickly look at just one aspect of public luxury. What would it look like in terms of the realm of cooking and eating? Now, at a first stage, we can imagine something like high quality, universal free school meals and breakfast clubs being provided for primary and secondary schools. Finland, for example, has had a free school meal program in place since the 1940s, with children from pre-kindergarten up to the end of secondary school all provided with a healthy meal. The UN has also recently set out universal school meals as an important part of the right to food. Now, such steps would be significant for time saving, but they would also be incredibly important for responding to issues like childhood food poverty. Beyond this, though, we might also imagine communal kitchens, which is a real resource for those times when cooking feels more like a burden than a pleasure. We could draw inspiration here from the public canteens of World War II. Now, World War II is mostly thought of as a period of food rations and household scarcity, but the war was also a period during which some of Britain's poorest actually ate better than they typically had before. And this was because, in response to the problems of feeding the population during wartime, the British government established and subsidized a program of public kitchens designed to provide healthy and nutritious meals. These were known as British restaurants, but they were originally known as communal kitchens until Churchill decided that sounded too communist. He demanded that they be called British restaurants. Now, some of these canteens had table service, others were organized more like a cafeteria, and many had services by which people could order food to go. And at their peak, these kitchens were producing around 4 million meals every single week. Most remarkably, their walls were decorated with works of art that were taken from Buckingham Palace and the National Museums, which is perhaps as good of an example of public luxury as one is likely to find. So cooking is currently wildly inefficient and wasteful of food, of energy, and of time, but there are plenty of interesting alternatives that we might learn from and imagine. Now, our third and final demand then is temporal sovereignty, which is clearly tied to the fight for free time and is partly a response to the challenge of managing social expectations around reproductive labor. So how do we do that collectively? Now, as Martin Hagelin writes in his book, This Life, if it were given what we should do, what we should say, and whom we should love, in short, if it were given what we should do with our time, we would not be free. Now, under capitalism, we are given the answer to the question of what we should do. Capitalism forecloses in advance the question of freedom for so many people and for so much of our time. Fundamentally, the vast majority of us must accept giving up 40 hours or more per week in order to survive, and we typically have to select from a very narrow range of possible jobs where decisions over what we do on a daily basis ultimately lie outside of our hands. Under conditions of increased temporal sovereignty, we would be faced with the immense question of our own desires. What do we want to do with our time? And how do we want to normatively organize our lives? Temporal sovereignty means that the question of what we should do and how we should do it is perpetually open to contestation. And indeed, the idea of conflict or contestation urgently needs to be considered here. After all, there are alternative emancipatory goals that might clash with post-work's idea of minimizing necessary labor time. And adjudicating between these competing goals is a core element of a truly free society, one which would no longer have our time determined by things like coercion, dominance, and market discipline. So, for example, in a truly post-capitalist society, we can imagine values that might contradict the simple goal of reducing labor. A large public institute supplying childcare, for instance, might be able to minimize work as much as possible by mobilizing efficiencies of scale. But such an institution might also conflict with values around democracy, accountability, and flexibility. So a future society might instead choose to build more localized cooperative forms of childcare, even if they mean more work had to be done by society. These sorts of trade-offs would exist throughout a post-capitalist world and would require people to consider and grapple with them. So ultimately, we argue what matters is not so much the endless reduction of necessary labor per se, but instead the cultivation of time and institutions through which we might consciously and collectively guide the development of humanity. That's what we imagine after work. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Oh, I guess unmuted as the applause died out, but there was applause, just so you know. Hello.
Hi.
Right in time.
How
Thanks
you
so much
doing?
for joining. Thanks for that great overview. I think that having just finished the book last week gives a really nice intro to, and well, more than an intro, I would say a good recap of some of the main points. I'll maybe kick it off with a few questions, but also just being considerate of everybody's time, both on your side and ours. Maybe I'll kick it over to the audience if there's some questions. But maybe
I'm just gonna grab the baby monitor and
yes.
and get myself a glass of water. But I'm here. I'm in the mix now. Hi.
I think the question I wanted to start with is kind of based on something or a writer in an article you guys cite in the book, which is Mike Davis's article about who will build the ark, in which he kind of debates himself in one article, in which he first writes the pessimistic take on why climate change is already too late. We've only blown past it and there's nothing we can do. And then he ends the article with sort of his optimistic take on why there are some affordances we can look at that might give us some hope. Similarly, I was curious, what is your pessimistic take on we're not going to get to this post-work society, and what are maybe some hopeful signs that we are on the way, and there's maybe still, we're moving in the right direction of some of the problems you point out.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are actually quite a few hopeful signs. I think more than there were 10 years ago, per se. There is, for instance, there is a lot of more movement on things like the shorter working week. So unions across the Western world, at least, are picking up on this and making it a key priority, even in America, which I hardly expected that to happen anytime soon. But union bosses are saying, well, we want a 4-day working week. You have, that sort of idea being discussed in the mainstream press in a serious way that seemed, again, impossible like 10 years ago, but it's now being taken quite seriously. You have a lot of companies sort of from the bottom up deciding, well, this might be a good way to entice workers into our business, particularly among tech companies. They can't really compete with the salaries of big tech, for instance. Instead of offering huge salaries, they're offering 4-day working weeks for their workers. So there's a lot of businesses which are picking up on it and adopting it. And then you also have a sort of groundswell, I think, of anti-work sentiment before COVID, but then I think COVID has sort of intensified that feeling. So you've got things like Reddit's anti-work forum. You've got the Taiping, the Lie Flat movement, I believe, in China. And then you've got this sort of, various memes going around on TikTok and Twitter and elsewhere of like, I don't dream of labor. all these sorts of things that are really, I think, speaking to a more general antipathy towards work, which again, 10 years ago didn't really exist. So I'm more optimistic about the future of post-work than I would have been 10, 15 years ago. I do think there's quite a few opportunities emerging.
And maybe kind of leaping off of that, like, what you just gave as the hopeful examples are a lot of, I guess, like groundswell initiatives. Well, I think in the book, there's a lot, and also in the presentation just now, there's a lot of examples of like regulatory change. Obviously, the book, I think, does a really good job at like balancing, that both are, possibility spaces. It doesn't give much to like your own personal feelings of like maybe what you think the bigger possibility space is. And maybe that's not something universal to be said, but I was curious if you think, despite the examples of like Cuba changing the definition of family or Denmark universalizing the right to daycare, do you think that there is worthwhile effort to be made to put pressure on regulatory changes, or similar to where you put your hope in, it really has to come more from groundswell and grassroots initiatives to gain ground in these ideals?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of everything. I think the state is sort of like an insurpassable battlefield at the moment, and so I think it's a mistake tactically and strategically to ignore the state and think that we can just sort of exit from it in any serious way at the moment. There is still possibilities of transforming the state in ways that are better suited to a post-work project and better suited to the working classes, not as some sort of naive hope about the liberating power of the state, but instead simply as one battlefield amongst a number of different ones. And I think that's the best way to look at that. We try and point to those examples of existing regulations and policies around the world to say, there are options that are possible, that there is flexibility in the state. It's not simply a tool of the capitalist classes. It's much more complicated than that. So yeah, we do have some focus on that, but ultimately it's going to require, whatever you want to call it, bottom-up movements, social movements, people power, whatever. It requires, that sort of really significant mobilization of people to actually bring about any real significant change. And, ultimately, we're talking about a post-capitalist world here. It's the overthrow of the capitalist order. That is not going to happen easily or overnight or, even non-violently.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe the point that I would make is that there's not really a hard and fast distinction between the two tendencies that you're kind of pointing to there, the sort of the normative and the policy. Actually, I think one of the things that we kind of get at in the book is how one shapes the other. Actually, they're mutually constitutive in a lot of ways. And one of the things that we argue for almost is this sort of removal of sort of state actions, sort of policies that artificially buttress certain ways of living over others. So actually, sort of, oh my god, it's so distracting. I don't talk. All I can see is this thing moving around. Sorry, it's like opening 1,000 windows and closing them. It's really fucking with me. But yeah, so actually, they're removing sort of artificial sort of bolsters and the structures that uphold a certain set of values in an unacknowledged form in order to allow the sort of space for different kinds of ways of life to emerge. So the basically transforming the ideological infrastructure that makes ways of living possible. And I also think that, actually in terms of how you get change in terms of the policy landscape, that's really through these sort of bottom-up grassroots movements. So it's not one or the other. It's sort of understanding how they might inform each other and work together in kind of different ways. I mean, you made this point the other day about think tanks. Like we got asked a question about, well, should we just be pushing for like a leftist think tank sort of landscape, sort of. Mont Pelerin Society of the Left, and there are certain affordances to that kind of model, but it lends itself more to right-wing interests and right-wing thinking. So really, whilst there may be space for that kind of intervention, it makes much more sense to be thinking about how we build solidarity from the bottom up.
And have those pressures kind of like ladder up into, instead of like trickle down, in that sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, in general, I think your book does such a great job at that sort of balance of like, it's not either or. But I was curious about your writing process, and maybe, you know, this can be about that balance, but also maybe writing together. Like, I think this is, if I'm not wrong, the first time you wrote a book together, and also just curious what that writing process has been like. But also maybe in what ways the form and the scope of the book has sort of emerged out of that versus how much it was kind of planned from the beginning to keep this what I would call a pretty concise but overviewable book, and rather than maybe, you know, as I'm sure the temptation was, to really deep dive in certain you know, rabbit holes that you found.
Oh, we did that. Like I was 100% the worst for that. So we basically, on a practical level, the way that we divided up the book was that we basically started with it came out of a talk that I did in 2016, something like that, where I kind of got into these 4 areas of that become the 4 main chapters of the book. So technologies and standards, and the social relations of the household, and the physical space of the home, and sort of talking about how we might draw on these concepts to produce a more robustly feminist form of post-work politics. And so we sort of started from that in the expectation that there would be a pretty profound evolution as the project went on. But actually, they proved to be quite sticky as ideas. We sort of went into a lot more depth and detail, but we sort of divided them up between us and sort of drafted chapters separately. And the 2 that I drafted were initially the one on domestic spaces and the one on the family, and they ended up being like 30,000 words and 50,000 words a piece. And so I just basically put it all in, and I'd go to Nick like, look what I made for us, look what I did. And then he'd react with sort of abject horror at the fact I'd give him this enormous editing task. I'd be like, you'll go. So I did not resist the urge to do a deep dive. And in fact, actually, one of the major things keeping us on track were, we had 3 kids over the course of writing this book. And so I had various sort of hard deadlines with each of the pregnancies. I was rushing to finish a chapter beforehand. So whilst I do place a lot of blame for the delay in this project on the fact we decided to have kids, I also have to be grateful for the fact that they really pushed me to actually finish anything. So I did have to do it. But
yeah, that's very impressive.
I think we submitted the final version like the week before the 3rd child.
Wow. I mean, this is something that I couldn't help but wonder while reading it, and sort of knowing this, that you guys started to write the book before having any kids, and then kind of finished it while having 3 kids. You know, the book shows so many crazy things about family life in the modern day, about how, you know, one of the examples that the amount of time that we spend with our kids is not less, especially because the social pressures on raising your kids and the amount of activities you have to put them in to set them up for success have raised so much. It made me think twice about, do I still want a family, or what does that even mean, and what pressure is on that? Writing this while doing that must have been, you know, either it really exhilarated, you know, the 2, or gave you some pause. I was just curious, and maybe it's too personal of a question, but like, what was that process like?
Yeah, too late now. It feels like a joke that's gone too far at this stage. Like,
well, yeah, the book is finished as well, so I guess, yeah, no way back on both counts.
Yeah, but I mean, I think one thing that's been really helpful in terms of having this project, well, these 2 projects, you know, both of them kind of ends in themselves to some extent, the children and the book, is that it does force us to be reflective about habits that we lapse into, because I mean, as I think we make clear in the book, standards and norms are not things that you can simply opt out of and pretend aren't there. Actually, you are structurally inscribed within a system that means that you work with these norms. Even if you actively choose to resist them, it still is shaping the possibility space. You know, it's telling you what's possible. So, you know, a lot of decisions that we make, particularly stuff around like intensive parenting. So there's a lot in the chapter on the family about how we now are increasingly seeing this trend towards very, very hands-on cultivation of the child as a repository of human capital. And you know, I mean, we are definitely not immune to that. I think, you know, we do, like, occasionally there'll be a lot of hand-wringing about screen time and, you know, anxiety about too many chicken nuggets and, you know, a sense of like, do we need to be enrolling them in Mandarin classes? And, you know, we're not like, as we can't entirely remove ourselves from that context. You know, particularly as you get fed a lot of it directly from the school here, like, you know, and also there's been a real intensification of my entanglement with the frustrations of platform capitalism since our oldest started school. He's just finished his first year in school. He's 5, and it's really unbelievably frustrating to have like 6-7 different childcare platforms that we have to navigate. You know, one for paying for school meals, one for picking up homework, one which sort of documents his progress, you know, one for charting absences and so on. And you're moving through all of these different platforms, and there's pieces of information on some that relate to others. You know, there's different email addresses for all of them. There's no coordination, so you get really sort of like trapped within this sort of this platform situation, and you know, they use, like, it is sort of Google owned platforms that are being used by these educational establishments. You can't, so again, this idea that you can opt out becomes increasingly compromised as you do get entangled through sort of institutional frameworks and infrastructures. So yeah, having written the book in the process of sort of laying the foundations of the family and engaging in this sort of gestational labor, we do try and be mindful about the way we divide our own work, be mindful of kind of falling into these traps, but it's definitely not just because you know that you're kind of getting suckered into doing things you don't want to do doesn't mean you can just sort of like say, okay, well, I'm not doing it. You know, you sort of end up in this horrible situation where you're like, well, I know this is awful and, you know, bad, and actually probably it's not fun for the kids, it's not fun for us, it's not actually beneficial, all the research suggests as much, and yet here we are doing it anyway.
I mean, sometimes you can get more energy out of you know, giving in and then having another day where you have the energy. I mean, in general, I think this is something I'm personally always wondering, and especially with post office, the space that we have here, you know, wanting to maybe create more active workshops, or, you know, taking up some of the mantles you put down of like specific work areas, specific things we should be thinking about. Obviously, it's different for everybody, but, you know, like you said, I think the book is so much about we should challenge some of the norms that have crept in, and, you know, once you start a family, you can start challenging those norms as a family, obviously. But that's not as easy as it, you know, easier said than done. Do you have a sense of like specific, you know, I don't want to say cost and benefit analysis, but it's like almost like effort affordance within those spaces that you section out of, like, and maybe, you know, to keep it specific, like a room of, I'm just going to generalize for a second, but like a room of young, you know, creative adjacent, artistically minded people, you know, where do you feel is the most worthwhile to put our eggs in? If you would have to say, again, knowing that everything is intertwined, but is it challenging norms? Is it starting our own institutions? I don't know, just curious what your sense of that is.
Yeah, I think maybe one area, one amongst many really, is thinking about housing and alternative forms of housing, simply because once these things get built, they're very difficult to sort of dislodge, and creating sort of material infrastructure, you know, an alternative to the single family home, which is enticing, and is not like, you know, a sort of stepping stone to a suburban family home, which it is particularly in a country like America and even in the UK. You know, creating properly enticing, affordable, meaningful public infrastructure, I think, is a really it takes a lot of work. It's not easy, but I think the payoff from it is also very big, because it just, you know, it just gets embedded, and then it's there for a long time. You know, the Barbican here in London, for instance, is, you know, going to be here for ages. So I think that's one place to look at.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously it's a big ask to say, hey, here at the post office, can you build your own version of the Barbican? I mean, I was going to say something similar, actually, because I was going to think about sort of projects around co-housing and collective living and things like that. In part because I've noticed in the sort of run up to the book coming out that it's sort of gaining traction in terms of the sort of mainstream imagination as well. Like, so I've seen a couple of pieces in sort of not very radical newspapers about collective living, you know, particular things like older women's co-housing. I've seen a couple of things about that recently. The sort of like the older lesbian co-housing initiatives, things like that. I think because there is a real interest in how we age, which is both out of concern for others, for you know, for our parents, for our older friends, but also sort of a selfish one of like, well, what do I want my old age to look like? So there's actually quite an investment in thinking, okay, well, you know, when I think about what it means to age in place, it would mean a very difficult process of transforming the physical space and also the social relations around me, so that I'm not in a situation where I feel lonely, isolated, where I have trouble getting to the things that I need, and so on. So like there is this sort of, I feel like there's a bit of momentum gathering around collective housing and co-housing, particularly as it relates to approaches to addressing the challenges of care. There is, I think, there's a collective here in the UK, possibly in London, I can't remember, called Ginger Giraffe. Pretty sure it's Ginger Giraffe. It's definitely ginger, an animal, but that's about sort of testing out these ideas of how people with long-term caring needs, so disabled adults, might develop sort of both spatial and social infrastructures through co-housing projects. So I think their approach, and this is going from memory because this is somebody I spoke alongside at an event around co-housing, and they were using nursing students. So basically, nursing students lived for free or very much reduced rents in these spaces with these co-residents, and they sort of created this sort of like cooperative caring kind of network, with this expectation that the younger people and the people who were in training would constantly be circulating and changing. But I just think it's interesting that it's like this approach to care through living space and through countering domestic realism seems to be like a really interesting angle. And having drafted that chapter, I can also say that like actually digging into the history is really fascinating as well. Like it's a really fun chapter to write, because you're dealing so much with something concrete rather than sort of I mean, the family was really interesting to write as well, but it's much more wrestling with sort of abstract shifts in the way that we live together, rather than being able to look at floor plans, which is fun in a whole different way. So yeah, I mean that is maybe where I would start. I think housing is a way to go. It's such a linchpin issue, and in some ways it's almost like I think it's a big complement to work. It's not identical to it, but it's entangled with it, and it's got the same sort of weight, in as much as just as the vast majority of us have a relationship with wage labour, all of us have a relationship with living space or lack of living space, you know. So I think it's a good place to invest some time and mental energy.
It also combines, I think, both the sort of infrastructural part of it, while you can also challenge the norms of how you live within your existing housing potentially as well. So I think sort of like creates two areas of work there. I mean, I think
maybe something around mortgages as well. Like, what's a tool for how do you circumvent the fact that people get funneled into these single family homes through sort of the financial instruments through which people are being taught to live their lives. So like, is there a way, how do you game the mortgage market to you know, like how do you work with things like, you know, squatting laws and things about repurposing existing housing stock and zoning laws, and really understanding what the conditions are on the ground, so that you can think, well, how do we push against them? How do we work within this framework to undermine this framework?
Yeah, for sure.
Against the mortgage.
I mean, I think it's also the cultural bubble. One of the things that stood out to me was the idea that even sort of house ownership or home ownership was almost promoted as a pro-capitalist tool, because if you had a home, you had more work to do, you were more distracted, you didn't have time for communism. So I think even just like popping the cultural dream of owning your home might be a very sort of like low key, not major, but like something to work on. The last thing I would say, just jumping off your point, I think I agree that I've seen a rise in even talk about co-living and co-housing, but it's gone hand in hand weirdly in also something like the Financial Times that then does talk about it, but hand in hand with sort of this rise of the network state kind of attempts at that. So it's sort of like, and they get kind of lumped in together. I don't know if in that rise that you've seen in the interest, is there, particular danger in that, or is that just something that kind of comes with the area in all cases, as also some of your examples show? There will always be sort of a either a neoliberalist or right sort of co-option of anything you try.
Yeah, this is sort of like the autophagic dynamic of repurposing, right? Like, as much as I'm really interested in sort of repurposing as a feminist methodology, but you have to almost, if you're thinking about like how things can be appropriated and turned against their original intentions, you've got to acknowledge that that's not a one-way street where we just appropriate all of these cultural resources and make them into sort of left-wing tools. It's going in multiple directions, and we sort of like, that's sort of the bum note at the end of that chapter on spaces, right, where it's like, yeah, actually all of the energy of the commune, which in which sort of was like a mass media product, as well as a thing in which sort of like hundreds of thousands of people actually lived in America in the 60s and 70s. It was really gaining kind of traction on the cultural imagination. At the same time, you sort of see how that gets gutted and then converted into this idea of, well, rather than living in the sort of the Dom Commune, the sort of Soviet collective house where we all share work evenly and to enable us to be full civic beings, actually what you get is like, okay, well, you can have like a WeWork space in the basement and like some horrible soulless like strip lit gym in like the middle, and then you can have a tiny little cell that you sleep in on your own, where everything's falling apart and like everything's crap, nobody cares for anything, and that will be sold to you as a digital nomad, like as like the height of urban living for the up and coming young professional. So yeah, it's kind of depressing to see how easily it can be co-opted, and with it the language of collectivity and the commons and so on, and billing these things as the collective house and relying on this sort of seemingly subversive or subcultural languages, and then just really pulling it back to like the most sort of financialized model of housing you can find.
Yeah. So be watchful is basically wherever you go. If anybody has questions, feel free to kind of like just come up to the laptop. Otherwise, I'll just keep talking. I also want to be respectful of your time, and I'm not sure. Like, I know it's getting later there as well. But
it's still sleeping.
Okay. I guess that gives us some more time. Yeah. Again, anybody feel free to step up. I'm just going to look through my questions. I know we kind of went to different places. I mean, since you did write out the breadcrumb trails, it sounds like, are there sort of planned other deep dives or things you want to pick up on that you've started in this book that you're working on now, or yeah? Yeah,
I mean, there's the family chapter was the one that was 50,000 words, and I think it may become like a self-contained pamphlet in itself. or at least I told myself that it might, in order to allow myself to let go of a lot of the research that went into it. Like I had to convince myself it would have an afterlife. So that might become something in and of itself. There's a and one of the, like you drafted there was a whole first section to the book, like, which was basically like a comparative history of different elements of social reproduction. So you think about healthcare, long-term care, cleaning. So there was a fourth as well, I'm pretty sure. Childcare, yeah. So like a bunch of material, very sort of empirical, that we just didn't find a home for. Like we wanted to put it in there because it's doing important work, but I think in some ways it's very academic work, where actually it's bringing together things that haven't been brought together before, which is of interest to just like nerds like us, but it doesn't actually do anything in terms of the political project of the book. And to the point where, like, at the end, like in the introduction, we'd said like, oh, if you're not interested in looking at the data, perhaps you will skip to section 2. And then our editor was like, maybe you just get rid of the first section. If you're warning people off it in the introduction, like, you're going to be bored by this. I would just, so we cut that. And we think that's going to become something, probably 2 things coming out of it. One is about the idea of the family as a carer of last resort. We think there is an academic article that's going to look at that concept. And the other is that perhaps we're just going to publish it as sort of a self-contained report for autonomy, which is a think tank that we work with here, a progressive think tank dealing with the future of work. So we think we might sort of publish it as a standalone report on comparative histories of social reproduction. So yeah, and we were saying the other day that we would, believe it or not, we were saying that we would like to do another project again, but together, but that we didn't want to start from like, hey, let's get the band back together, and then try and find a project that would fit. Like we have to wait for the project to emerge so that we can be on it. But like, considering that we live together and have made 3 kids and like basically spend all our time together, like we're still gonna keep going, still looking for the next opportunity to do more together. Really quite nauseating.
Well, there's some hope to be found there. Yeah, please. There's some questions from the audience. I'll just give up the talk.
Hello. Thanks for the book and the presentation. I'm Eli. It's the first book of you too that I was reading, and I think my question goes off a little bit from the book, but more like into the general idea of post-work that you both have. So I see post-work as a utopian idea or project, let's say, with maybe like a socialist kind of basis to it. And I know that in your book you see it as a given that the post-work already we live already in a post-work status, or how it could look like. But my question would be, how would you imagine an organization of that format of society? Or like, because still, of course, there will be labor in order to secure some kind of welfare, or even if there is shared communal spaces, these have to be organized, and some people would be in charge. So how would you imagine it being different from other socialist projects that being tried historically? Or yeah, what kind of imagination do you have for this?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think any socialist project has really actually taken up the post-work mantle. I mean, famously, the USSR was like, we need to rapidly industrialize, we need to make everybody work. And you know, I forget the name of the miner or something like that, but it was a whole Stakhanovite movement, where it's basically like hard workers are the forefront of our society. It was very much not a sort of post-work world in any meaningful way. So I don't think there's been any existing socialist society that's really aimed at post-work. I think, you know, the part of the problem is that the questions you're asking are sometimes things that can only be answered once we're actually in the moment. I am fairly hesitant about like trying to prescribe too much detail, but I think you're absolutely right that certain amounts of work need to be done in any society. It's, you know, one of the points we make in the concluding chapter of the book is that there's always going to be labor that needs to be done. We can't eliminate all of it. So we need to organize it in certain ways. And partly it's a matter of like organizing it by, you know, rewards and things that aren't based on money, for instance, because everybody is receiving, you know, all the needs that they have for, you know, for survival. It's not a wage-based society anymore. So people are receiving other rewards, whether it be status or time or things like that. There's ways to organize labor along different sorts of systems. If you're interested, I find Erin Benenav's book, what's the name of it again?
I think it's just Automation in the Future of Work, isn't it?
Automation in the Future of Work, that's it. I find it to be really good, sort of outlining some of these basic ideas of like, how would you organize a post-capitalist society? Along with a lot of references to, you know, other things to sort of chase up. And then, yeah, I mean, one of the questions we try and leave off with is, you know, we also need institutions for determining how we devote our time. Because, you know, there's the sort of common idea is that, well, you're just free to do whatever. And, you know, on an individual level, that might be satisfying for a little bit of time. But in fact, I think most of us, if not all of us, gain most of our pleasure from working with other people in various projects. We want to commit ourselves to doing something which is larger than us, beyond us. And building the institutions to allow that, they'd have to be, you know, democratic at least. They'd have to be able to scale up depending on the size of the project. There's all sorts of questions about how you go about designing these sorts of institutions and actually building them, which I think is something we can start doing right now. We don't have to wait till a post-capitalist world, but it's the sort of question which I'm not an institution builder. We're not institution builders, but I think it's something which is necessary for a future society.
Yeah, I mean, sort of building on that, I think there are two approaches to post-work or post-capitalist or post-scarcity utopias, and I divide them into dual realm and single realm utopias. So single realm utopias are those visions of the future of work in which work is dissolved into play. They become the same thing. So what you do to counter work is you make all work pleasurable and playful. William Morris is maybe one of the key examples of that, where you see this in his work, this idea that in the future, sort of work will be desirable. People will want to work. It will be something that people are desperate to do. That like even the worst kinds of work will have become playful and enjoyable, and actually all of these sort of endeavors will be significant and something that people will seek out. That work will become an autonomously chosen activity. And then dual realm utopias suggest that, well, there will always be this sort of recalcitrant rump of work that we can't get rid of, stuff that we don't enjoy, that is difficult, that we can't pretend is play, that is something else, and then there is the space of leisure and play. And actually those kind of utopias are based around extending the realm of freedom as far as possible. So that becomes sort of the orientation of those projects. So you're looking to extend the realm of freedom and minimize the realm of necessity. So you've still got this Promethean utopian bent where you're constantly thinking, okay, you never reach a stable point where you've got like, this is the work and this is the fun and never the twain shall meet. Actually, you're always looking, okay, how do we minimize this space of necessity? How do we continue to extend the realm of freedom? What does it mean as our technical capacities change, as our social relations shift? Like this constantly, this is utopia as a vector rather than an endpoint. And you see this, and I think you see this even in Morris, that there's still this acknowledgement that somebody's going to be cleaning the sewers, and that actually, okay, in the case of that work that is perhaps physically laborious and in itself unrewarding, something that's not an end in and of itself, there will be a whole swathe of compensatory structures, benefits and rewards that will come in to make that work more palatable and possibly enjoyable, not in itself, but as a means to other things. So we're in the dual realm camp, where we're like, there's always going to be some element of work, but to say that there's always going to be that element of work, it's not to draw a hard and fast limit on the emancipatory project. It's to you still want to engage in that process of contestation and institution building, and acknowledging that as we change what we understand to be work and what we understand to be necessary, or what we understand to be freedom, is going to shift and change. So the last line of the book is, we need the freedom to determine the necessary. And that's sort of the agenda between our dual realm approach to post-scarcity society.
Okay, nice. Thank you. No, yeah, I think it was a nice answer, and also it's of course not easy to answer this kind of question. There's like trillions ideas how this could maybe work or not work. But yeah, and then there is also of course some kind of smaller scale projects where people try this to live in smaller communes. And so you, as a fresh family, would you be interested, or could you see yourself living in that kind of smaller scale project that tries these kind of things with dividing work or responsibilities differently, but also having maybe different idea of living? And like, could you imagine yourself living in that way, or maybe starting a project like that?
Certainly not starting a project like that, simply because as the sheer amount of work that needs to be done in terms of like building the foundations to do it properly. I mean, Dolores Hayden's work on this is so good. Like her 7 American Utopias looks at these sort of like 7 examples of religious communities and how they worked and functioned and how they were formed. And like half the problem all the time is that things don't get properly planned. They kind of get bodged. People don't get, there's not enough concentration on where like the private and the communal intersect or don't intersect, or things sort of emerge in a hodgepodge way and then collapse. I mean, a lot of whether or not we consider those projects to be successful will depend on what we judge, what we take to be the criteria for success, right? So I don't think of them necessarily as failures, these historical examples, but they were successful on terms that don't necessarily depend on their endurance through decades and decades and decades. Where they don't succeed is shifting our relationship with domestic realism and enabling sort of forms of material counter-hegemony to emerge. That didn't happen from those examples. So I think possibly in another stage of life, when like so much of our cognitive bandwidth wasn't taken up with sort of like daily survival, in the sort of like far off world where we can both sit down in front of a computer to talk to people at the same time because one of us isn't taking care of the small babies. Like maybe it's something that you can start thinking about, but I also think it's something that needs to be done collectively, precisely because what you need is this very in-depth understanding of like the boring stuff, as I was sort of talking about earlier, this like understanding the financial instruments, understanding the regulatory implements, understanding building codes and all of that stuff. And actually what you need quite a lot of brain power and quite a wide skill set in order to be able to do that. So at the moment, simply because we live in a kind of like atomized society, we don't have this pool of people who we can be like, okay, let's get in, let's do this. And I think there is a reason why Hayden's examples are largely drawn from religious communities, because actually there is a pool of people together with they are affinity groups. Essentially, these are communities based on shared values and shared projects, shared spiritual and religious projects. So they've got a ready-made community to mobilize. Actually, the nature of the way like our workplaces work, our social lives work, it's really hard to get that kind of momentum to steer these projects in a meaningful way. I mean, if you've ever it's the most depressing thing, like every conference or whatever I go to, after you meet some people where you're like really on the same wavelength, and you're like, yeah. Oh, we're going to totally follow up after this. Like we should do something. We should collaborate. And then like maybe there'll be one email, but then things will just fizzle out because everybody's tired and exhausted and being squeezed from so many different ways. So when you think about that, not in terms of just like, oh well, let's stick around and write a book, but you actually think, okay, well let's build a life and live together. Like it's really, really very challenging. So I think again it comes back to a lot of what's at the core of the book, of the need for there to be this changing together, in order to make these kinds of things possible. But really, if anyone can do it, the kind of people who are young, creative, engaged, politically active are the people to do it, not old, middle-aged, tired husks of people. We'll just stick to the books for now.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
There are some more questions.
Maybe it's line up, so I mean, I might not be.
Hi. Yes, perhaps the question is in the book, which I unfortunately haven't read yet, but from my own perspective, I'm like very interested in like both post-work and also the home, because I am a person with disability with what they call a distance to the labor market, but also someone who kind of qualifies for assisted living. So like you have people with disabilities who are not capable of kind of, you know, maintaining a flow in doing like the tasks in the house, and then also the wage labor, like especially if you are by yourself, like it's sort of your own responsibility to make sure that your house like doesn't become a ruin, while also, you know, like having to do all the other things that take energy. So I receive a social worker who actually, you know, helps me with my daily tasks and planning and organization and like the house chores and those kind of things. That is seen as like kind of more independent than like assisted living arrangements, which are in a way like a bit Foucauldian in the sense that, you know, like the deviation from the norm is pulled together as like a shared infrastructure, and then there are like these caretakers who are there like 24/7 as a job, like they get paid for that. It's also publicly funded. So I was wondering, like, have you looked at these type of situations from a afterward perspective?
Do you want to talk about long-term care centers?
Yeah, I can talk about long-term care centers. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question, and I think it's not. I don't think it's a coincidence that there's a certain model of assistance that has taken priority over another one. You know, one which is based on the sort of, again, it's within the atomized family home rather than the sort of the communal space, because there has been this, it's part of a wider tendency, a specific example of the wider tendency towards the gutting of these communal spaces, and the sort of almost targeted quest to make them inhospitable, to make them unappealing, to make them undesirable, as this broad effort to entrench single family homes as a norm. But one of the things so I lead a program called the Feminist Futures Program for Autonomy, which is this think tank that we work with. And one of the things that has been explored as part of that, alongside Autonomy Urban, is this idea of the long-term care centre. So it's about thinking about infrastructure that sits between the home and the hospital. So actually a space where people with different needs, both carers and the cared for, have access to a space that isn't hospitalized, with all of the kind of the lack of autonomy that can be associated with that, but also isn't the domestic residence, where actually it can be, for carers, it can be a highly stressful environment. And, you know, for the cared for, I think it can be like a real hotbed of interpersonal tension. You know, if no matter how deep the relationship, before it gets into this sort of caring dynamic, it can become very difficult very quickly to manage these caring needs. There's a study that came out of Japan that found that a really significant percentage of people who cared for relatives hated the person that they cared for. So they actively said that they hated them, and acknowledged that there were these dynamics of abuse that were in place within the single family home. And I think that's significant, given that we have this sort of repeated sort of narrative that the institution is to be feared, that it is the site of abuse, that it is the site of neglect. But you see that that's also true of the single family home. It's just hidden in a different way, and the person who is abusing and the person who is neglecting is in a different kind of relationship to the person who's being cared for. So yeah, long-term care centres really started from a lot of the work that's out there about carers in particular, and how things like increasingly medical technologies and things like that are being brought into the home as hospitals are looking to discharge people quicker and quicker. So things like wound dressing, things like changing sort of drugs ports, things like intravenous medication, changing catheters, kind of coming into the home more and more. So you have this situation where it's both highly specialized and highly demanding work involving these medical technologies, and it's still amateur, and there's not proper training for it, and it becomes this real source of anxiety for carers, because they think, well, if they do something wrong, it's somebody's well-being at stake. It's somebody's health that they're dealing with a lot of the time, and also when you're dealing with these sort of medical technologies, there's also this pressure to turn the home into a hospital-like space when it comes to things like hygiene. So this pressure to keep things super clean, super sterile, in order to make things sort of work. And I know this is not the same sort of thing as you're talking about, but it's sort of what led us to the long-term care centre, was this need for there to be a space where actually, first of all, carers can get some respite. People with caring needs can be away from the people that they're with day in, day out, when those relationships are at risk of becoming fraught and tense. And also a place where you can get sort of training and support with this kind of thing, like actually somebody who will really take the time to explain, this is how this works. And we kind of link it in a little bit with like the Buurtzorg model of delivering nursing care, and thinking about the possibilities for self-management, as well as integrating these different, at the moment, what in the UK in particular are sort of sliced off into very distinctive realms. So, medical care versus doing the shopping for somebody, versus checking in on somebody, versus talking with somebody, thinking about how you might be able to integrate those. So there's that, we're very interested in these sort of intermediary spaces, on the one hand to provide for these basic needs, but also thinking about how might these be vectors for public luxury. Can we imagine these spaces as also being like leisure centres, can they have pools, can they have saunas, can they have spas, can they run exercise classes, can there be libraries? Like, how do we imagine this, the very fact that we're all vulnerable, precarious bodies, but that vulnerability and precarity is unevenly distributed, how do we not push that aside in terms of thinking with a sort of speculative utopian bent, but actually make that the foundation for thinking about what a good life is? How do we take our vulnerability and the necessity of caring and being cared for, and fold that into a vision that is unapologetically emancipatory and transformative? And that's sort of one of the real challenges we set ourselves with the book, and it's not easy to do. I don't know if you had stuff to add.
Nothing to add there.
Thank you. I think we had one more question. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much for the talk. The question I want to ask was about, I feel like, so in this moment in the US and in the UK, but to a lesser extent also in the Netherlands, there's this moment of, the resurgence of the trade union movement, and a lot of demands being made in this context are sort of relate directly to the workplace, which makes sense. And I was wondering if you see an opportunity for this movement also to, maybe move closer to the types of demands that you are posing, if you see this already happening, or if not, if you feel like there's an opening there.
I mean, I think to a certain extent it is already happening, because for several decades there's been this focus on pay in particular, and working conditions to a lesser extent, as being the kind of demands that are being put forward by unions, and sometimes they are very modest and compromised demands, or they have been over the past 30 years or so, as we've sort of struggled along through, particularly in the UK, with this very broken trade union movement. But there's also been in recent years this real return to the classic demand of the labour movement for the shorter working week, You know, the Trade Union Congress in the UK is one of those institutions, those organisations that is sort of taking up this demand, and you're seeing it as well with a lot of smaller unions, the Communication Workers Union, I think the RMT, I'm trying to think who, looking towards the towards shortening the working day or the working week as another area to apply pressure. So I think there is this move towards sort of like post-work labor movement, post-labor labor movement in that sense.
I'll talk about my own union as well, the UCU, particularly the local one to my university. One of the things they pushed for and successfully got recently, for instance, was more support for childcare. So the university now is paying a significant chunk of nursery fees, for instance, which are hugely expensive here in the UK. So there's, I think some of the more forward-thinking unions are also starting to incorporate, not just shorter working time stuff, but also thinking about the reproductive aspects of working life as well.
Nice, thank you. Anybody else have a question from Michelle? All right, maybe then we got kind of to the end. Thank you guys so much. Really enjoyed this conversation. I think we definitely got a good sense of the book and probably even some beyond. So yeah, I just want to thank you. Thanks everybody for coming. And
Thank you for having us.
we'll follow up on email, but thank you both again and for making this happen at such a late time as well.
No,
Appreciate it.
thank you for putting up with us being so late. We appreciate it.
Oh no problem. All right, speak soon. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Thank you.